There's a tension we all feel when life doesn't go according to our plans. We've all been there, waiting for an answer, waiting for a breakthrough, waiting for something to change. And in those moments, it's easy to wonder, why hasn't God shown up yet? It's tempting to assume that because we don't see movement, God isn't working. But here's the truth. God's timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't align with ours. What feels like a delay to us is often a sign of divine precision. God operates outside of our schedules, outside of our timelines, and outside of the limitations we place on him. And while that can be frustrating to our human nature, it's also where faith grows. Think about the times in your life when you were desperate for something to happen. Maybe you prayed for it, worked for it, planned for it, and yet nothing seemed to change. You wondered if God had forgotten about you. But the reality is, God's delay isn't a sign of his absence. It's often a sign of his intentionality. He knows what we need, and more importantly, he knows when we need it. Sometimes he's protecting us from something we're not ready for. Other times he's preparing something far greater than what we had in mind. Either way, his timing is always for our good. The problem is we live in a culture that's obsessed with instant results. We want everything now. Instant gratification, instant success, instant answers. And when God doesn't move at the speed we expect, we can start to question his plans. But here's what we need to remember. God is not confined to our deadlines. He's not in a rush because he's never late. His timing is deliberate, purposeful, and perfect. And when we align our expectations with his timing, we open the door to peace in the process. One of the most powerful examples of God's perfect timing is found in Scripture. Think about the story of Lazarus. When Jesus heard that his friend was sick, he didn't rush to heal him. In fact, he waited 2 more days before going to Bethany. By the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days. To those watching, it must have seemed like Jesus was too late. But what they didn't realize was that Jesus wasn't operating on their timeline. He was operating on God's. And when he called Lazarus out of the tomb, it became clear that the delay wasn't a denial. It was an opportunity for God's glory to be revealed in a way that no one could have expected. That same principle applies to our lives. When it feels like God is late, it's often because he's setting the stage for something greater. He's working behind the scenes in ways we can't see, orchestrating events and aligning details that will ultimately lead to his perfect plan. But the challenge for us is to trust him in the waiting. It's to believe that his timing is better than ours, even when we don't understand it. Trusting God's timing requires us to let go of our need for control. It requires us to surrender our plans and embrace his. And while that's not always easy, it's where true faith is found. Faith isn't just believing that God will come through, it's trusting him even when it feels like he's taking too long. It's choosing to believe that he knows what he's doing even when we don't. And it's holding on to the truth that his timing is always perfect, no matter how imperfect it may feel to us. It's easy to misinterpret a delay in our lives as a sign that God is saying no to our prayers. When things don't happen on our timeline, we start to wonder if God has forgotten about us, if he's changed his mind, or if he's even listening at all. But what if I told you that a delay isn't a denial? What if instead of being a roadblock, the delay is actually a season of preparation? Because more often than not, God uses delays to prepare us for the very things we're praying for. Think about it. If God gave you everything you asked for the moment you asked for it, would you really be ready for it? Sometimes we think we're prepared, but God sees the bigger picture. He knows what we're capable of handling, and he knows the timing that will allow us to thrive instead of struggle. The waiting period is not wasted time. It's God's training ground. It's where he refines our character, strengthens our faith, and equips us for what's ahead. Consider the story of Joseph in the Bible. He had a dream that one day he would be a great leader. But his journey to that dream was anything but immediate. Instead of stepping into leadership right away, Joseph faced betrayal by his brothers, slavery, false accusations, and imprisonment. To an outsider, it might have looked like God had abandoned him. But every delay Joseph experienced was part of God's preparation process. Through those trials, Joseph developed resilience, humility, and the wisdom he needed to eventually rise to a position of power and fulfill the dream God had placed in his heart. In the same way, the delays we face in life are often about what God is doing in us, not just what he's preparing for us. Maybe you're waiting for a relationship to heal, for a door to open, or for a breakthrough in your career. Whatever it is, remember that God isn't just interested in the destination. He's invested in who you're becoming along the way. He's shaping you, teaching you, and preparing you so that when the promise comes, you'll be ready to receive it. But here's the challenge. We don't like to wait. We live in a world that celebrates speed and instant gratification, so when God slows us down, it can feel frustrating. Yet those moments of delay are where trust is built. They're where we learn to depend on God instead of our own understanding. They're where we discover that his timing is not just different from ours, it's better. So if you're in a season of waiting, don't let the delay discourage you. Let it remind you that God is preparing you for something greater. He hasn't forgotten about you, and he hasn't changed his plans. He's simply making sure that when the time comes, you'll be ready to step into the fullness of what he has for you. As human beings, we often approach life with a narrow lens. We see what's right in front of us, our circumstances, our challenges, and our immediate needs. But God operates on a completely different level. His perspective isn't limited by time, space, or circumstance. He sees the full picture of our lives, past, present, and future. And because of that, he's able to orchestrate events in ways that we can't comprehend. The challenge for us is learning to trust him even when we don't understand what he's doing. Have you ever tried to put together a puzzle without seeing the box? You have a handful of pieces, but without the big picture, it's hard to make sense of where each piece fits. That's often how life feels. We see the individual pieces of our story, our successes, failures, joys, and struggles, but we don't always understand how they fit together. God, on the other hand, has the box lid. He knows how every piece connects, and he's working to complete a masterpiece that's far greater than we could imagine. One of the reasons we struggle to trust God's perspective is because we want answers now. When things don't make sense, we demand explanations. We want to know why something happened, why it didn't happen, or when it will happen. But faith requires us to trust God even when we don't get the answers we're looking for. It's about believing that he is good, that he loves us, and that his plans are better than anything we could come up with on our own. Think about the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. When God delivered them from slavery in Egypt, he promised to lead them to the promised land. But instead of taking the shortest route, God led them on a longer, more difficult journey. From their perspective, it probably felt unnecessary and frustrating. But God had a reason. He knew that if they faced certain challenges too soon, they would lose heart and turn back to Egypt. He was protecting them and preparing them, even though they couldn't see it at the time. In the same way, there are times when God's plans don't align with our expectations. We think we know what's best for us, but our vision is limited. We can only see the moment we're in, while God sees the ripple effects of every decision and every delay. He's not just concerned with our comfort, he's committed to our growth, our purpose, and our eternal destiny. So when life feels confusing or unfair, remind yourself that God sees what you can't. Trust that he's working all things together for your good, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment. Trust that the detours, delays, and disappointments are all part of a bigger plan. And most importantly, trust that the God who sees the full picture is the same God who holds your future in his hands. Faith is one of the most profound aspects of our relationship with God, but it's also one of the most challenging to live out, especially in seasons of waiting. When life feels uncertain, when prayers seem unanswered, and when the silence stretches on longer than we expect, that's when faith is truly tested. Faith isn't just believing in God when everything is going according to plan. It's trusting Him when nothing seems to be happening, when the answers aren't clear, and when you're tempted to give up. Waiting can feel like a void. It can feel like you're stuck in a place where nothing is moving forward and you're left wondering if God has forgotten you. But faith reminds us that God's silence is not His absence. In fact, some of the most significant work God does in our lives happens in the waiting. Waiting isn't a punishment, it's a process. It's where God strengthens our trust, builds our character, and prepares us for the blessings He has in store. The Bible is filled with examples of people who had to trust God in seasons of waiting. Abraham was promised that he would become the father of many nations, but he waited 25 years for Isaac to be born. David was anointed as king as a young man, but he waited years, enduring trials and opposition before he took the throne. And then there's Noah, who built an ark for decades before the first drop of rain ever fell. In every one of these stories, God was faithful to fulfill His promises, but the waiting was a crucial part of the journey. It was in the waiting that their faith grew, their reliance on God deepened, and their purpose became clear. One of the hardest parts of waiting is resisting the urge to take matters into our own hands. When God doesn't move as quickly as we'd like, we're tempted to force solutions or create shortcuts. But that's where faith comes in. Faith is surrendering control even when you don't see how things will work out. It's saying, God, I don't understand why this is taking so long, but I trust that you know what you're doing. It's choosing to believe that God's timing is better than ours, even when it feels like He's late. Isaiah 40:31 says, but those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This verse reminds us that waiting isn't passive, it's active. It's not about sitting around doing nothing. It's about staying grounded in faith, continuing to seek God and trusting Him to provide what we need in His perfect time. Faith in the waiting is what keeps us anchored when life feels uncertain. It's what gives us hope when the future seems unclear, and it's what reminds us that even in the silence, God is working behind the scenes for our good and His glory. God's ways are higher than ours, and His plans often unfold in ways that defy our expectations. As humans, we tend to look for straightforward solutions, logical outcomes, and predictable patterns. But God operates on a divine level, using methods that we would never anticipate to fulfill His promises. When we're praying for a breakthrough or waiting for a promise to come to pass, it's easy to get caught up in how we think it should happen. Yet time and time again, God shows us that He doesn't work according to our plans. He works according to His perfect wisdom. The Bible is full of examples of God working in unexpected ways to fulfill His promises. Think about the story of Gideon. When God called Gideon to lead Israel into battle against the Midianites, He didn't rely on a massive army. Instead, He reduced Gideon's forces from 3,200 men to just 300. To Gideon, this must have seemed like a recipe for disaster, but God had a plan. By defeating the Midianites with such a small group, God ensured that the victory could only be attributed to Him, not human strength. Gideon learned that God's ways may not always make sense, but they are always effective. Another powerful example is the life of Jesus. The Jewish people expected their Messiah to come as a conquering king who would overthrow their oppressors and establish a physical kingdom. But God fulfilled His promise of salvation in a way no one expected through a humble carpenter from Nazareth who preached love, forgiveness, and sacrifice. Jesus didn't come with an army or political power. He came to lay down his life for humanity. God's plan to redeem the world was far greater than anyone could have imagined, and it came to pass in the most unexpected way. In our own lives, we often have preconceived ideas about how God should work. We pray for specific outcomes, map out our ideal scenarios, and get frustrated when things don't go according to our plans. But the truth is, God's ways are not limited by our understanding. He can open doors we never saw coming, use people we didn't expect, and create opportunities out of situations that seemed hopeless. What looks like a setback to us might be the very thing God is using to position us for his purpose. When we hold too tightly to our expectations, we risk missing the unique ways God is moving. Faith requires us to release our need for control and embrace the mystery of God's methods. It's about trusting that he knows what he's doing, even when we don't understand it. As Isaiah 55, 8-9 reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." If you're waiting for God to fulfill a promise, don't limit him to your expectations. Stay open to his creativity and trust that he's working, even if it doesn't look like you thought it would. God's unexpected ways are often the most extraordinary, and his plans always exceed what we could imagine. Patience is not just about waiting, it's about trusting God while you wait. In our fast-paced, instant gratification culture, patience often feels like a lost virtue. We want results now, breakthroughs now, and blessings now. But God operates on a different timeline. He is far more interested in refining us than rushing us. When we embrace patience, we allow God to shape us into who we need to be for the purpose he has planned. And the truth is, what God is refining in us during the waiting season is often far more valuable than the thing we're waiting for. Think about the process of refining gold. It doesn't happen instantly. The gold must go through intense heat to remove impurities and bring out its brilliance. The same is true for us. The waiting seasons in life, the moments when we feel stuck, delayed, or overlooked, are often God's way of refining us. He's removing the things that don't belong: impatience, pride, fear, and self-reliance. At the same time, he's building the qualities we'll need for the next chapter: faith, humility, endurance, and trust. One of the greatest examples of patience producing purpose is found in the life of Moses. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep before God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. From a human perspective, that may have seemed like wasted time, but God was using those years to prepare Moses for his ultimate purpose. In the solitude of the wilderness, Moses learned humility, dependence on God, and leadership. When the time came for him to step into his calling, he was ready. Not because he rushed the process, but because he allowed God to refine him in the waiting. Rushing God's process often leads to frustration and missed opportunities. When we try to take shortcuts, we can end up settling for less than God's best. Look at the story of Abraham and Sarah. They were promised a child, but when the waiting became too hard, they took matters into their own hands. The result was Ishmael, a child born out of impatience rather than promise. Yet even in their mistake, God was faithful to fulfill his promise in his perfect time, giving them Isaac. Their story reminds us that while impatience may create temporary solutions, it's only God's timing that brings lasting purpose. Patience is not passive, it's active trust in God. It's choosing to believe that his timing is perfect, even when we don't understand it. James 1:04 says, "Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Patience is the vehicle through which God completes his work in us. It's how he equips us for the challenges and blessings ahead. So if you're in a season of waiting, resist the urge to rush. Don't try to force what God is still refining. Instead, embrace the process. Trust that God is using this time to prepare you for something greater than you can imagine. Patience isn't just about enduring the wait. It's about becoming who God created you to be.